Well, we begin today's show looking at Afghanistan, a month after the Taliban seized power. The New York Times is reporting there's been a dramatic drop in violence in the Afghan countryside following the Taliban takeover and the U.S. withdrawal of troops. One doctor in Warlord province reports his hospital has no patients with conflict-related injuries for the first time in over 2 decades. But the hospital is in a crisis as it is unable to pay salaries or buy new medical equipment. On Wednesday, United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres warned Afghanistan is facing a dramatic humanitarian crisis and urged foreign governments and institutions to keep supporting the people of Afghanistan. UNICEF has warned 1 million Afghan children are at risk of starvation. We go now to the capital, to Kabul, where we're joined by Anand Gopal. His latest article, The Other Afghan Women, appears in The New Yorker. It's based on his deep reporting in the rural villages of Afghanistan that have been devastated by decades of war. Anand Gopal is also the author of No Good Men Among the Living, America, the Taliban, and the War Through Afghan Eyes. Anand, thanks so much for joining us. Can you talk about who the other Afghan women are?
Thanks, Amy. When we were watching the images streaming from Kabul of people desperately trying to get to the airport, including many of my friends, it was easy to come to the conclusion that perhaps what was happening right now was the worst thing that had happened in the last 2 decades. And of course, there were many Afghans who wanted to get out because they desperately want a better life. And I don't blame them for that. There was another reality actually at the same time that wasn't really covered as much. And that was happening outside of Kabul in rural areas where for the bulk of the last 20 years, the war was actually being fought. So we think of the war in Afghanistan as just happening in Afghanistan, but actually it wasn't fought in most of the country. There's only particular provinces where the fighting was happening. So I visited Helmand province in southern Afghanistan, which is really the epicenter of the violence for the last 2 decades. And I wanted to see how women there who had been facing roadside bombs and night raids and airstrikes, what they thought about the U.S. withdrawal. So that's The Other Afghan Women in the title. And so the piece is actually about trying to get their views of how they looked at the American withdrawal after 2 decades.
And Anand Gopal, just to make clear, over 70% of Afghanistan's population is rural. So we have, in a sense, a highly distorted view because we hear about urban areas, and in fact, not just urban areas, only Kabul or principally Kabul. Now, among the people that you spoke to in one village, Pan Kile, a woman told you that a large number of her family, all civilians, had been killed in the last years, and you went and spoke to many other families in the village and found that on average, every family had lost 10 to 12 family members during the war that they refer to as the American War. Could you elaborate on what they told you?
Sure. So the woman in question, her name is Shakira, and she's a housewife who lives in a very small village in the valley of Sangin, which was one of the areas of the most intense violence over the years. And so I had the opportunity to meet her and interview her a number of times. And, I'm somebody who's been covering this conflict for many years, and even I was taken aback by the sheer level of violence that people like her had gone through and had witnessed. So she lost, as you said, 16 members of her family. But what was remarkable or astonishing about this was that this wasn't in one airstrike or in one mass casualty incident. This was in 14 or 15 different incidents over 20 years. So there was one cousin who was carrying a hot plate for cooking and that hot plate was mistaken for an IED, a roadside bomb, and he was killed. There was another cousin who was a farmer who was in the fields and had encountered a coalition patrol, and he was shot dead. Shakira told me his body was just left there like an animal. So there was so many different instances. So people were reliving tragedy again and again. And it wasn't just Shakira, because I was interested after interviewing her to see how representative this was. So I managed to talk to over a dozen families. I got the names of the people who were killed. I tried to triangulate that information with death certificates and other eyewitnesses. And so the level of human loss was really extraordinary. And most of these deaths were never recorded. It's usually the big airstrikes that make the media, because in these areas, there's not a lot of internet penetration. There's no media there. And so a lot of the smaller deaths of ones and twos don't get recorded. And so I think we've grossly undercounted the number of civilians who've died in this war.
And Anand, one of the other women that you spoke to, Pazaro, said to you, they're giving rights to Kabul women and they're killing women here. Is this justice? She said. I mean, in a sense, as you show in this piece, the other Afghan women, there are two different realities in Afghanistan. There are probably more, but with respect to the attitude towards the Taliban taking over the country. Could you talk about that? You've covered, of course, as you said, the war extensively over many, many years from Kabul as well as elsewhere across the country.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about women's rights in Afghanistan, we tend to think about the ability to go to school, to work, to have representation in parliament. And these are real gains that were made in the last 20 years. But there are other women's rights that aren't talked about. So when I asked Azaro or other women, what do you think about the claim that the U.S. was bringing women's rights to Afghanistan? They told me, we can't walk outside without worrying if we're going to get blown up. So what right how is that protecting our rights? It's also a part of women's rights to be able to walk without fear, to be able to live as a woman's right? So they had a very different conception of women's rights, which was not that they rejected the aspiration for wanting to get educated or to wanting to have a public role, but they also didn't want to be shot at or have their loved ones killed. And so they had a very different conception. And so when I asked them about the claim that the U.S. was bringing women's rights, they're very skeptical and many of them were cursing the United States, saying they brought us nothing. So, for example, one person said they were bringing rights to Kabul and they were just bombing us here, essentially. So it's a country that has different realities, and I think we need to be able to hold both of those realities in our head at the same time.
Anand Gopal, if you can talk about the empowering of warlords by the U.S. occupation. If you can tell us the story of Mir Dado and take that right through to a person who ended up at Guantanamo.
So Mir Dado was a member of the Mujahideen, which was the holy warriors or the rebels, the rural rebels that were fighting against the Soviet occupation. The Soviet occupation was a brutal occupation that killed millions of people in Afghanistan, and so naturally people are rising up against it. But at the same time, some of these rebels were being supported by Pakistan, by Saudi Arabia, and especially by the CIA. And so there was the creation of warlords or strongmen. There was never warlords in Afghan history until the start of the wars in 1979. So Amir Dado is one of these warlords, and he came to prominence in the Sangin Valley in the mid-'80s. He was a major drug trafficker. He was also somebody who held a religious court, and he basically acted the way we think the Taliban would act now. He would make sure women stayed in the home. When people tried to marry for love, he would have them arrested. He kidnapped people. I mean, he was really considered a real brutal strongman. When the Taliban emerged in the mid-'90s, the main reason they emerged was to fight against people like Amir Dado. So they came to the Sangin Valley in Helmand in early 1995, and they demobilized him, and he fled the country. And then for the next few years, the Sangin Valley and places in southern Afghanistan were at peace. And so that was the kind of perspective that a lot of the women there had, which is that they don't like the Taliban, but they hated the warlords. And so at least the warlords are gone, and they would accept that. Then when the U.S. invaded in 2001, they did something astonishing, which is that they brought those very same warlords back into the country. They had a choice there. They could have tried to support local Afghans. They could have tried to help build a democracy with the incredible yearning there is in Afghanistan for a better world. I mean, people like Shakira, the woman I profile in the piece, she wanted the U.S. to invade. She hated the Taliban, and she wanted the support. Instead, what the U.S. did is they brought people like Amir Dado back into the country. The reason they did that is because the U.S. never really cared about building a democracy in Afghanistan. The mission was always about counterterrorism. It was always about trying to find quote unquote bad guys. And so they brought these warlords back in who could be their partners. And so for the next 2 or 3 years, from 2001 until 2004, Amir Dado basically terrorized the Helmand countryside. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people, innocent people were arrested, people were killed. There's the multiple cases of people who were wrongfully accused of being Taliban members and sent to Guantanamo. There was essentially a one-sided war that was waged by the U.S. and its allied warlords like Amir Dado against the Afghan population in Helmand. And that ultimately is what led to the reconstitution of the Taliban by 2004.
I mean, you talk about Amir Dado suspected of being responsible for the killing of U.S. Staff Sergeant Jacob Frazier and Sergeant Orlando Morales in March of 2003, but he managed to point the finger at a Taliban member who ended up being sent to Guantanamo.
Yeah, I mean, this is an example of the extraordinary, chaos that was happening there, and the ways in which the strongmen were using their access to the Americans to eliminate their enemies. So what happened in this case was that the U.S. Special Forces went to meet some members of the Afghan government in Sangin, and Amir Dado, who was a U.S. ally, engineered an attack, an ambush on U.S. troops. It killed 2 U.S. soldiers, Special Forces personnel. They were the first 2 U.S. soldiers who died in Helmand as a result of violent activity. And the U.S. themselves, internally among the Special Forces, began to suspect that their own ally, Amir Dado, was the one who was behind the attack. Nonetheless, Amir Dado took basically some random guy who was had nothing to do with the attack, who was an ex-Taliban who had surrendered and was sitting at home, took him, tortured him, and then delivered him to the U.S. and said, this guy here is the person who is the real culprit. The U.S. sent him to Guantanamo. He spent 3 or 4 years in Guantanamo. And when I looked at the classified documents from Guantanamo, which were eventually released by WikiLeaks, what was extraordinary in those documents was that the investigating judges and others knew that this person was innocent. They wrote in the documents that Amir Dado, the U.S. ally, was the one who actually conducted this ambush. But nonetheless, this person languished in Guantanamo for 3 or 4 years. His case is not unique. This has happened hundreds of times across the country in those years.
And Anand, as you've pointed out in a recent interview with Reveal News, one of the effects of the way in which the U.S. supported these warlords and made them extremely wealthy is that they had an incentive to continue the war and an incentive to continue producing terrorists. Now, you mentioned earlier that Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, Pakistan in particular, played a critical role in supporting the Mujahideen during the Soviet occupation. Could you say more about the role of Pakistan in supporting the Taliban all of these years, and what role you think the country will play, Pakistan will play, in the interim government, its relations to the people who have been appointed in the interim government by the Taliban?
Well, Pakistan supports the Taliban very closely. A number of the senior leaders of the Taliban were living in Pakistan, so the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence agency, was basically sheltering the senior Taliban leadership. There's a very close working relationship there. But it's very important to understand the history here, which is that in 2001, when the U.S. invaded, the Taliban was defeated. To a man, they basically either surrendered or escaped and ran away. So there was, in 2002, no Taliban in Afghanistan. There was no resistance whatsoever. Al-Qaeda as well fled the country. They went mostly to Pakistan and some of them to Iran. So you had thousands of U.S. troops on the ground in 2002 with a mandate to fight a war against terror, but with no enemy actually to fight. And so this was the context in which they began to incentivize the allied warlords to basically produce bad guys and enemies for them. They started to arrest these people and kill them. This created the insurgency. Once the insurgency was created, and this is now 2004, then Pakistan got involved and tried to influence the insurgency for its own interests. Its own interest is it basically views Afghanistan as its own backyard and doesn't want Indian influence. And so Pakistan's role in Afghanistan has been a very malign role, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the ultimate cause of the war in Afghanistan was by the U.S., its actions in the early years.
I wanted to ask you about a part of the article that hasn't gotten very much attention. Anand, you tweeted, CIA-created Afghan death squads were evacuated before many American citizens. Can you explain?
So from the very beginning, the U.S. created these militias. And as I mentioned earlier, warlordism and militias, that's not something that's natural to Afghanistan. It really emerged in the late 70s, early 80s as a result of the war. In 2001, the U.S. really invented some of these, created some of these groups. So there's a group called the Coast Protection Force, which was a CIA-created militia in the southeast of the country. There's many groups like this around the country, and they were seen as the CIA's closest allies in trying to fight the Taliban. And many, many innocent people, many civilians were suffered as a result of this. And so their methods were seen as extraordinarily brutal. What happened with the evacuation last month was that these CIA death squads were essentially the ones that were one of the guards of the airport itself. And the reason they were there is ultimately they were going to be evacuated as well. And it was a horrific scene as I was talking to colleagues and friends who were on the ground. Sometimes these death squads are shooting at crowds. Also, the Taliban wasn't always letting people through. It was chaotic. But ultimately, all of these death squads got evacuated. There are still American citizens here in Afghanistan today trying to get out. But the CIA militias are all out. They're now living in the United States. And it's not the first time this has happened. There have been other CIA-backed strongmen who have been living comfortably in the U.S. for the last decade or 2 decades. And so this is kind of, I think, an indictment on what the CIA's priorities are in terms of Afghan lives.
And Anand, before we conclude, if you could comment on the people the Taliban has appointed to serve in the interim government. You've said that what's striking in the list is that the most powerful members of the Taliban, those who were running the insurgency in the last 20 years, have been excluded. What are the implications of this? You've said that this might create a shadow government.
Yeah, I think that, when we see the Taliban cabinet that was announced a few days ago, I mean, all of those figures in the cabinet were held similar positions in the 90s. But the powerful people in the movement, some of them were military commanders, others do have cabinet positions, but they all kind of exist in what's called a shura, leadership shura, which is in Kandahar. That's really who's controlling the country. There's a prime minister. He's a longtime member of the Taliban, but I'm not sure how much power he actually has. The real power is behind the scenes. And I think that's tragic for Afghans because that means even less accountability. The previous regime that was here for 20 years had very little accountability. There was elections, but those elections were mostly rigged. And a lot of the real decision-making was done behind the scenes. And I think there were some Afghans who were hoping that this would be a change. I think this is not going to be a change. It's going to be further down the line of zero accountability and power being wielded behind the scenes.
Finally, I wanted to ask you, main issue that you write about is the countryside versus Kabul. We know a lot more about what's happening in Kabul. You write the Taliban takeover has restored order to the conservative countryside while plunging the comparatively liberal streets of Kabul into fear and hopelessness. Can you end with that?
Well, there's activists, women's rights activists, people part of civil society, et cetera, all of which only appeared in the last 2 decades and only appeared because of the American occupation. And for people like that, this obviously is they're facing despair, and it's very understandable. Many of them have been able to leave the country. Many are still stuck here in Kabul. And Kabul is a relatively liberal area compared to the countryside. And there are more freedoms for women here than there are in places like Helmand, where I visited. And the idea that the Taliban are going to impose the mores of Helmand onto Kabul, I think, is a tragedy because it means that people who've enjoyed some freedoms for the last 2 decades are going to see them rolled back. All of this, I think, didn't have to be this way. The U.S. had the opportunity in the early years to negotiate with the Taliban when they were much weaker. They had the opportunity to try to create an inclusive government. But instead, they chose the path of war. And here's where we are now. Nobody's really won from this. The people in the countryside are breathing a sigh of relief because there's no war. but the people in the cities are terrified. Nobody's actually happy with the outcome, and that's a tragedy.